Yeah, so I'm not going to spend so much time introducing myself. What I will say, though, is I'm very passionate about this topic of psychedelic exceptionalism, sort of moving beyond it and ending the war on drugs. Not only as a research topic, but something that's very much impacted my immediate family. And so I've had a kind of upfront and personal experience of seeing how the drug war, specifically in the UK context, impacts people and very much can destroy people's lives or definitely set them back. So yeah, it's an emotional topic for me. I know it is for many other people. So as we move through this, I really invite you to just track and notice what's happening in your body. If you feel sensations, maybe some discomfort or parts where you're constricting, I just invite you to notice that, breathe into it if that feels good, because it can be a lot. And yeah, I'm hopeful that for those of us in the room or watching this on replay that are really serious about ending the war on drugs, we'll start to hold this piece of how psychedelic exceptionalism can really get in the way of doing that. So to begin, it might be good to give a definition of what psychedelic exceptionalism actually is. Some of you might be familiar with the term, for some it might be different, or the first time that you're hearing it. So psychedelic exceptionalism is an ideology that claims that psychedelics should be privileged for reform, but other supposedly more harmful drugs like heroin and cocaine should remain prohibited. And someone that speaks a lot about this is Carl Hart. You might be familiar with his work. He's written a great book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, and he has an article that came out in Psychedelics Today in 2020, also talking about psychedelic exceptionalism and some of the issues with it. So I'm going to just share a quote from Carl Hart in this article. So this term refers to the perspective that psychedelics are somehow better and more useful than other classes of drugs like opioids or stimulants. I was trying to remind people that these are all psychoactive substances. They interact on receptors in the brain to produce their effects, and we shouldn't be treating some drugs as if they're special, while other drugs are somehow evil. Drugs all carry some risk, and depending on how you define danger, they fall on different levels of the spectrum of risk and have different benefits. So I very much agree with Carl Hart on this, and it's challenging as someone who believes not only in the medical benefit of psychedelics, but also is aware of the war on drugs and really wanting to dismantle that in the psychedelic space there is so much privileging of seeing these things as medicines that are inherently good, that have no risks, and I don't think that's the case. And moreover, with the psychedelic exceptionalism being such a strong thread, it means that there is this ongoing stigma and stigmatization of certain people and certain drug users, which justifies punishment and dehumanization and criminalization of lots of groups of people. So you have some drug users that are vilified as addicts and kind of a social problem, while others who may use psychedelics are more and more being celebrated for seeking out healing. There's a lot of value judgments that get roped in with this. And I'm really seeing this quite a lot in the media and the kind of mainstreaming of psychedelics that's happening in documentaries like Have a Good Trip on Netflix, which again are kind of seeking to normalize psychedelics as medicines and drugs that are good for you without really speaking to the dangers and the risks of even what accessing these substances, which are still illegal in most places in the world, can mean if you're in a body like mine or many other bodies. Right? But these things aren't spoken to. So there's a lot of people now who think, because of all the media that's accessible about this, that these substances are legal or accessible easily, and they're not even aware of the risks to themselves within the criminal justice system of what it means to try and access these things. So I think that's something we need to be aware of. So in thinking a little bit about the war on drugs, which is, again, a really huge topic, and we could easily have a whole conference on it. So this is just a small taster of some key points about it. As many of you might know, it's a historical project, but also an ongoing project with global reach. I used to think about 10 years ago or so that it was mainly something that existed in the US context. But as I've gone deeper into this work and been researching it, I understand how its tendrils are global and really impact the UK, Brazil, many other countries. And I'm going to speak to some of these threads a little bit. So the war on drugs is a global campaign that's really been led by the US federal government of drug prohibition, military aid, and military intervention with the aim of reducing the illegal drug trade in the United States. So it officially began in 1971 with President Nixon declaring drug abuse to be public enemy number one. And this led to the creation of the DEA and lots of federal drug prohibition and enforcement. There's many people who also talk about, the process of colonization actually also being a moment of prohibition, because in those processes, for example, when the British colonized Nigeria, which is part of my heritage, plant medicines that my ancestors were using were also prohibited. And that was a dynamic that happened during a lot of colonization too. But for our purposes today, the war on drugs officially began in 1971. And what these drug policies do is they impact people's access to education, to housing, to employment, child welfare, and whether you can actually parent your children, immigration, and many other public benefits in the United States and the other countries that have drug policies. So many countries in the Americas, including Guatemala and Colombia, and many others, have US-imposed restrictions on morphine and other painkillers because of the war on drugs. So the US will say, if you want to receive aid or funding from us, you cannot have morphine accessible to your population. So this means that thousands of people are dying every year in pain because of drug policies and how it's tied to funding and to aid. And there's many other examples of this. So a lot of research that's been conducted on how the war on drugs operates seems to be concluding that the war on drugs is very much a war on people. It's not so much about the drugs. It tends to facilitate a form of social and racial control that disproportionately seems to impact African heritage and Black people in the USA, Brazil, and the UK, but not limited to those countries. Those three are just the areas I know most about. So as an example from Brazil, according to Amnesty International, who did a study in 2016, in Rio de Janeiro alone that year, the police killed 920 people because of some supposed relationship to drugs. And the majority of these people are Black Brazilians. In the US context, where there's a lot of information about this topic, one of the most striking pieces that some of you might have heard of is the sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. This has been reformed somewhat with the Obama administration, but prior to that reform, the disparity was 100-to-1 crack cocaine to powder cocaine. So what this means is despite these drugs being the same chemically, it's just crack cocaine is powdered cocaine with baking soda and heat added, you would have the same amount of time in federal prison, 5 years, for 5 grams of crack, as opposed to 500 grams of powdered cocaine. Now, if these drugs are chemically the same, what's the difference, right? The difference is powdered cocaine is associated with wealthy white people, and crack cocaine is associated with working class or poor Black people. So this is just one of many examples of the disparity in how these policies are being used as a form of racial and social control. So a quote from Kojo Koram, who's one of the books on the presentation that I recommend checking out, says that the 20th century project of global drugs prohibition has consistently reinforced racial ethnic divisions within and between the nations of the world. So if you do want to learn more about this, some of the resources that have been really supportive for me are on the screen. There's a documentary called The House I Live In. These books, The War on Drugs and the Global Color Line by Kojo Koram, is fantastic. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And a couple of organizations that do really amazing work on this is the Drug Policy Alliance in the US and Release in the UK. Given that we are in the UK context, and as I said, so much of my understanding of what this war on drugs phenomenon was kind of rooted and linked to the US, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how this actually works in the UK context. So the slides and stats I'm going to show in this next section come from Release, from a policy paper they put out in 2018 called The Color of Injustice. And most of this data comes from 2016-17, so it's a few years ago. But from what I understand, the research they're doing now, not much has really shifted. So this first slide shows that Black people were stopped and searched for drugs at almost 9 times the rate of white people, while Asian people in the UK were stopped and searched for drugs at almost 3 times the rate of white people. And when it comes to arrests, 17% of arrests of Black people, so all arrests of Black people, result from stop and search, which is more than 3 times the proportion for white people, which is 5%. And then arrests for drug searches have halved for white people, that halved between 2010-11 and 2016-17, but have actually maintained for Black people. So some of you might know there's been a general trend in the UK policing to stop prioritizing, criminalizing people for personal possession. They haven't been putting as much funding into that. So in Bristol and Avon, for example, they've really tried to deprioritize that. But what we're seeing is that the rates are dropping for white folks and they're not being stopped and searched as much, but they continue targeting Black people and Asian people, despite this no longer being a priority. And the last one I'm going to show for now is that in terms of convictions, we also see this trend of racially disproportionate drugs policing. So Black and Asian people were convicted of cannabis possession at 11.8 and 2.4 times the rate of white people, despite lower rates of use. And these are just a few of the statistics in this policy paper. I really recommend checking out the paper in full. There's also the numbers in black and white, which was a report from 2013, which is kind of tracking earlier data. But I think it's important to note that, yeah, this idea that some of us may have and that I used to have, the war on drugs is just happening in the US. It's very much happening in the UK as well, and still really impacting lives and destroying families. And yeah, it's very much happening here too. So as much as it's easy to point the finger over there, I think it's important to look at our own cultural context and understand how this relates and ties in. So how does this all relate to psychedelic exceptionalism? I'm going to begin with a quote from Dustin Marlin, who's a professor of law at the University of Massachusetts. So focusing on psychedelics alone will not end the racist, ineffective, and draconian war on drugs. In contrast to other controlled substances, arrests linked to psychedelics have been relatively infrequent and generally have not targeted people of color. And yet over 1.5 million Americans are arrested for drug-related violations each year, often in connection with over-aggressive policing and racial profiling. Black Americans constitute only 15% of drug users in the US, but account for 37% of those arrested for drug violations. Nearly 80% of individuals in federal prison for drug-related offenses are either Black or Latinx. In the UK, we can see in our prison population for drug offenses, it's still massively disproportionate based on the numbers of the population we actually have who are Black or from other ethnic backgrounds. So why do we need to move beyond this in the psychedelic space? How is psychedelic exceptionalism holding us back in this aim to end the war on drugs? Well, exceptionalism still perpetuates carceral logic. And this is a really nice way of saying it that my dear friend Ismail Ali put, meaning that this idea that psychedelics are the good drugs means that we're still saying people who use bad drugs deserve to be criminalized, deserve to be imprisoned, that we still need prisons when it comes to society or to manage the drug problem, right? Which I personally don't believe, and many of you probably don't too, yet that ideology perpetuates that. It's leaving certain people behind. If we talk about empathy and compassion, do we have an empathy gap if we cannot extend that to people who use heroin instead of psilocybin? It ultimately ignores how the war on drugs operates and the people it disproportionately targets. I don't hear that many conversations about the war on drugs when I'm at psychedelic events and panels. I hear it spoken to as lip service. We have to end it so we can come out the psychedelic closet. I hear things like this, but then I'm thinking, okay, but is anyone talking about what happened to my brother? Or the fact that even if you're just a Black person growing up in London who doesn't use any drugs, you can still be targeted and have your life ruined because of how these things are at play. It ultimately minimizes the need to create policy that repairs the harms that have been done via the war on drugs. So when we think about reparative policy, I'm really looking at the Drug Policy Alliance, for example, who've put forward some really incredible policy to think about how cannabis, in being decriminalized or legalized, can actually benefit the communities that have been harmed from drugs-based policing for decades and decades. So an example of this is what's happened in Chicago, where there's a certain amount of tax that is added to cannabis that's being sold, and that tax revenue goes into a fund, which then supports Black communities and Latinx communities who have been really decimated by drugs policing for the last decades. So I hope we can see initiatives like that really start to be introduced to the UK as the markets open up and as we move towards decriminalization or sort of more mainstreaming and access to psychedelic therapies. I know that the latest piece of research Release put out was actually a kind of Drug Policy Alliance influenced paper looking at what reformative cannabis policy could look like in a UK context. So I'd recommend checking that out. To give an example of cannabis from the US and sort of showing again how the war on drugs can get in the way, it's my last point for now, is the example of Sha'Carri Richardson, who is a fantastic athlete based in the States, who was set to compete at the Tokyo Olympics. The Tokyo Olympics was meant to happen in 2020, actually happened in 2021. So she was doing some trials before a track and field tournament, and she tested positive for cannabis. And she lives in Oregon, where cannabis is legal at a state level. But as a punishment for this positive test result, the US anti-doping agency banned her from competing for 1 month and expunged her qualifying victory in a 100-meter race. So she wasn't able to compete. But simultaneously, as you see in this picture, the Tokyo Olympics was featured for being the home to many white cannabis entrepreneurs who were selling their products. So you have this ongoing disparity, right, of who the war on drugs is actually targeting and who is getting to benefit from these markets that are opening up and making money off that. And I think it's something we need to be really mindful of because we're seeing already how similar the pattern is when it comes to the psychedelic space. And if we want that to change, we need to start talking about the war on drugs more and what reparative policy could look like. And ultimately, psychedelic exceptionalism is preventing us from building coalitions from other drug policy and harm reduction organizers and movements. If we continue just framing psychedelics as something that's really curing people from addiction or from bad drugs or something that's medical and healing based, rather than owning the fact that we're drug users and nice people take drugs, then we're preventing ourselves from building these coalitions, from being in networks of support with people like the Drug Policy Alliance, like Release, Harm Reduction International, who are doing a lot of the work that's needed to actually dismantle the war on drugs rather than playing lip service to it. So if we decide that we want to advocate for the dignity of all people, regardless of what substances they consume or choose to put in their bodies, we need to build coalitions, we need to focus on ending the war on drugs, and making sure we have policy that repairs the harms that have been done to communities, predominantly communities of color, due to drugs-based policing. Thank you.